Welcome back, goobers. Today we'll be talking about Franconian notation, which is where the bulk of the nuts and bolts of this series is. Franconian notation is where the systems that are essential to understanding Michaud's work really begin to crystallize. So we're going to be thorough about this in stark contrast to last time where we glossed over a whole lot. I'm not going to sugarcoat things here. This subject has some real bullshit, some true dog doo-doo, some bona fide bunk. Some of this stuff is the most brain-dead hogwash known to man. But I've got you, and we're going to make it through this step by step. If you ever get lost or something doesn't make sense, pause the video, take some deep breaths, rewind it, and try again. My brain broke several times when I was learning this, so I promise you you're not having a stroke. I've got you covered. But before we get started, as always, remember to like and subscribe and leave any questions in the comments. Make sure you hit the bell icon to get notified when I post a new video. I'm looking to grow the channel and would really appreciate your help. So without further ado, let's dive in. This here is our good friend Franco of Cologne. Oh, what's that? Why, yes, he was the first to suggest that the duration of any note should be determinable by its appearance and not strictly from context, whose lexical revision of notation stayed fundamentally intact for centuries, potentially as late as until 1600. How could you tell? Franco was a music theorist of the 13th century who, for such an influential figure, has a pretty enigmatic story. We don't know where he was born or where he was residing at any point in time, only that at one point he worked for the Knights Hospitaller of Cologne, and that at another point he worked at Notre Dame de Paris. We do know, however, that sometime around 1260, he wrote the Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, or the Art of Measured Song in English, that sought to resolve the many ambiguities of modal notation without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In modal notation, ligatures, or characters representing multiple notes, the composition and organization of which was key to determining the rhythmic content, could be split because of a change in a syllable or because of a repeated tone, and the subsequent isolated pitch could have upwards of 4 different interpretations of duration. Additionally, the rest, and this other crucial symbol called the diviso modi, were what was needed to determine another third separate thing called the ordo, and they all looked pretty much the same, so, the theme here is ambiguity. And such trifles likely made the process of reading slow, tedious, and uncertain. It could be deciphered and preserved, but few people, and I mean very few, were even near fluent. The modal system of notation was all the rage thanks to a recently published book called De Mensurabili Musica by John de Garlandia, who was a total schmuck, by the way, and this book did a lot to set modal notation in stone. But our homie Franco was a man of action, and this simply would not stand, so off to work he went. As he set writing about the art of measured song, he determined to write something direct and practical. The book speaks of nothing aside from innovations in determining note duration and is full of musical examples. This is a book by a musician for musicians. The release of this book, we have to assume, was met with acclaim, because his methods proliferated throughout Europe at an alarming rate, kickstarting a series of developments which would lead to the period of musical excellence and vitality now referred to as the Ars Nova, by inventing the first system ever of mensuration. But before we actually learn what this marvelous system is, what the hell is mensuration? In a pithy phrase, it just means measurement in Latin. But there's a more useful definition that you'll want to keep in mind for the remainder of the series. Mensuration is the relationship between the durational value of one note and the durational value of the note of its next smaller species or level of subdivision. The fundamental principle of Franconian notation is that every note is divisible by 3, i.e., every note is composed of 3 equal smaller notes. It doesn't allow for duple division of notes. That would not come around for another 60 or so years. Whereas modal notation legally only had 2 species of note values, the longa and the brevis, although with alteration you could argue there were more, Franco introduced a third one called the semi-brevis, or the semi-breve, which was shorter than the breve, though it was scarcely seen in his own time. Essentially, 3 semi-braves fit into the breve, and 3 braves fit into the longa. Think of it as a Russian nesting doll, or this disturbing image I drew back in high school. Let's review the figures for these note species. A square with a stem, also called a pilum, to the right of it, is a longa, or as we shall call it from here on out for brevity's sake, L. An unadorned square is a brevis, or brave, or as we will henceforth call it, B. And an unadorned square rotated 45 degrees is called a semi-brave, or as we will call it, S. From there, the art of measured song branches into 2 curricula. One about the rules for perfection, imperfection, and alteration, essentially how to depict mensuration in writing, and how to deal with the corner cases that emerge from that, and another about rules for constructing and interpreting ligatures, which we'll discuss in depth next video. Regarding perfection and imperfection, we touched on them a little bit last time, but we're really going to go into greater detail now. It remains the case that perfection means triple, and ternary, and 3, and all that, and that imperfect means duple, binary, and 2, yada yada. However, more specifically now, perfection means that a note is quote-unquote complete, i.e. composed of exactly 3 of its immediate subdivision, or the next smaller species. So a perfect longa has 3 brevis, and a perfect breve has 3 semi-breves. By contrast, an imperfected note consists of 2/3 the durational value of its perfect counterpart. So an imperfect longa contains 2 brevis, and an imperfect breve contains 2 semi-breves. A perfect breve plus an imperfect longa equals a perfect longa. It seems simple enough, and so far it is. The only problem is that there is no way to tell just by looking whether a note is perfect or imperfect. It depends on context, 100% on context. Franco wasn't completely free of the shackles of his modally minded predecessors and contemporaries. So how do we tell whether a note is perfect or imperfect? There are 4 initial rules to determine this. In a vacuum, or by default, a note is perfect. However, a note is imperfect if it is either preceded or followed by a note of the next smaller species. If a smaller note can imperfect a larger one, it must do so. When it does this, it is considered to have imperfected the larger note. Additionally, the notation is read from left to right, so the order of operations occurs left to right as well. So if a B is placed between 2 L's, the B is considered to be imperfecting the first L, and the second L is considered to be perfect. Let's look now at 6 basic examples, and with the obligatory anachronism warning, we will operate under the assumption that a longa is equal to a dotted whole note for strictly pedagogical reasons, of course. In example 1 here, the L occurs in isolation, making it perfect, meaning that it has the duration of 3 Bs. In modern notation, this is analogous to the dotted whole being composed of 3 half notes. In example 2, we have a B preceding an L. Because a smaller note must imperfect its larger neighbor if possible, this B is considered to be imperfecting the L that follows it. The imperfect L has the value of 2 Bs. The value of the notes in the example is still equal to 3 Bs, so you can think of the B imperfecting the L as taking up the remaining space to still comprise 1 unit of perfection, totaling to 3 breves. In example 3, we have a B following an L. Because of the same rule which applies whether the B precedes or follows the L, this L is imperfect. This is just the flip side of example 2. In example 4, we have 2 L's side by side. Because there is no smaller note value, imperfection is impossible and both notes are perfect. In example 5, we have what I was talking about earlier, where the B imperfects the first L, but not the second because the order of operations occurs from left to right, and a note can only imperfect one other note, so no note can pull double duty of imperfection. Because of this, the notes have the following values: imperfect L, B, perfect L. In example 6, we essentially see the same construction as we saw in 3, a larger note being imperfected by a subsequent smaller note. Yes, the species are different, but remember the semi-braves are to braves as braves are to longas. There are, however, 3 exceptions to this fundamental rule. 3 exceptions to remember. First, a dot of separation, also called a dot of division or point of separation, prevents a smaller species of note from imperfecting a larger one. It's just a little dot placed between 2 notes. So a dot of separation placed between an L and a B prevents that B from imperfecting the L. Essentially, it serves to delineate where exactly one quote-unquote unit of perfection or integral unit begins and or ends, i.e. what is the boundary for deciding what group of notes, while imperfecting each other, add up to the value of one perfect long. Let's look at 4 more examples for this. In example 1, we see an L on one side of the dot and 3 Bs on the other. The dot stops them from interacting with each other, so everything is as it appears. The L is perfect, and the Bs imperfect nothing. Each side of the dot adds up to 3 Bs, i.e. there are 2 units of perfection in total. In example 2, the dot separates 2 imperfected L's and the associated B's that imperfected them. The first L is imperfected by the B that follows it, and the second is imperfected by the B that precedes it. In example 3, we have a combination of the first 2. A lone L stands to the left of the dot, making it perfect, and to the right we have the same configuration of an L imperfected by a B as we saw in example 2. Example 4 here is just the same as example 2, just with B's and S's instead of L's and B's. Because semi-brave is to brave as brave is to longa, the breakdown is the same. The unit of perfection simply shifts down to meet the level of the species in question. The second exception. When 3 braves occur between 2 longas, the braves are considered an integral unit or unit of perfection equal to 1 perfect longa. Ergo, these braves cannot imperfect either of the longas sandwiching them, which are thereby both perfect in a vacuum. I call this the sandwich exception. For now, let's work through a handful of examples of everything we've covered so far combined. In example 1, how are we going to work through such a thicket of neumes? I recommend, instead of working from left to right trying to figure out which notes are imperfecting which, it's much easier to think of your task as breaking up this chain of neumes into more easily analyzed units of perfection, which I call UPs for short. Reminder, a unit of perfection is a snippet of neumes that have a combined value of 3 Bs or 1 perfect long. Ultimately, It's the same task, just a change in mindset, which makes the job so much easier. Starting by looking at what the dot of separation is splitting up, the first UP is everything to the left of the dot. The B following the L is imperfecting it, so it's equal to 2 B's plus the remaining B equals 3 B's, i.e. a UP. Next, to the right of the dot, immediately we can see that there are 3 B's sandwiched between 2 L's, so we can instantly group these 3 B's as a UP because of the sandwich exception. With nothing to imperfect the final L, it's free-floating, i.e. perfect, comprising another UP. Lastly, the L before the sandwich B is still preceded by a B, which is imperfecting it, and for that reason it is imperfect, and the B plus that imperfect L combine to make our fourth and final UP. In example 2, we've got the same thing, so we're going to start by looking at the dot. To the left of the dot, we've got 2 L's, so we know we're working with multiple UPs. Going from left to right, the B will imperfect the L that it follows, rather than the one that it precedes, making the last L before the dot perfect. After the dot, we're still confronted by 3 B's, which ultimately have an L on either side, even if there's a dot thrown in. So the sandwich exception applies still here, and we have ourselves a third UP. That leaves the final L hanging solo, which makes it perfect, comprising our fourth and final UP in this example. In example 3, it's the same thing again. To the left of the dot, we've got a textbook 3 B's sandwiched between 2 L's, so the sandwich exception applies, meaning we've got 3 UPs to the left of the dot. One for the 3 Braves, and one for each of the perfect L's. To the right of the dot, there is a B imperfecting an L, making for a UP, and finally 3 free-floating B's, which imperfect nothing, but do comprise our fourth and final UP. Finally, in example 4, we have a series presented with B's and S's instead of L's and B's. There are 3 S's side by side between 2 B's, so we can start by calling that a UP on account of the sandwich exception yet again. Then, because the 2 preceding B's are isolated, both of those are perfect, so now that's 2 more UPs. And finally, the last B is imperfected by the S that follows it, creating another UP. So I hope that is all making sense. We'll be working through some more examples later, and for now we're going to move on. The third and final exception is called similus ante similem perfecta est. That glob of jargon, which goes by similus ante similem for short, which I like to further abbreviate to SIS, is a rule which means that a note preceding a note of the same species, primarily referring to longas but not exclusively, must be perfect without exception. This is crucial, so I'm going to repeat it. A note preceding a note of the same species must be perfect, no exceptions. The consequence of this, however, is that the rhythm perfect long, brave, imperfect long, perfect long, among other rhythms, is impossible to notate, because if the brave is imperfecting the second long, that imperfect long cannot be next to a perfect long in accordance with the rules of similus ante similem. Franco's solution to this dilemma was to reapply the solution of alteration, meaning the context-based changing of note values to solve corner case problems in mensuration, from modal notation to this new context. Specifically, the rhythm perfect long, brave, imperfect long, perfect long would now be notated as perfect long, brave, altered brave, perfect long. Altering a note doubles its length, so the altered brave is equal to 2 braves, the same as an imperfect long. Because of this equivalency, when similus ante similem requires alteration, the imperfect long in the impossible rhythm is instead notated as an altered brave, which is distinguished from a normal brave by context alone. Additionally, the perfect L could be replaced with the dot of division, and the same rule still applies. Ultimately, similus ante similem and alteration are 2 sides of the same coin, and if you see 2 B's between 2 L's, it probably means the second of those 2 L's should be altered, and thereby, those 2 B's comprise 1 UP. Let's work through some examples. In example 1, we have a UP to the left of the dot. Immediately to the right of the dot, there is the pattern of LBBL occurring twice back-to-back, with the second occurrence of it making use of the first one's final L as its initial L. Because that pattern implies similus ante similem alteration, we must alter the second brave in each set of 2, and then identify each set of 2 braves as a UP. Thereby, all 3 L's to the right of the dot are P, making 3 more UPs. In example 2, we're working with B's and S's again. To the right of the dot, we've got already a case of similus ante similem. The dot functions as the first B, and so the second of the 2 S's requires alteration. Thereby, there are 2 UPs after the dot, one for the S's and one for the lone B. On the left side of the dot, the first 2 notes are 1 UP, with the second note imperfecting the first, followed by another case of similus ante similem, this time a textbook one with 2 short notes bookended by their next largest species. So the second of these 2 S's needs alteration, and the preceding B is perfect, bringing us up to 3 UPs so far left of the dot. Then the subsequent B is imperfected by the S that follows it, and we have a sandwich of 3 S's, and then another pair of notes where an S imperfects a B, adding 3 more UPs and bringing us to a total of 7 when combining both sides of the dot. In example 3, to the left of the dot, Everything is pretty standard. We have 3 sandwiched S's forming 1 UP, and the 2 braves before it are both perfect, making for 2 more UPs. After the sandwiched S's, we have a B followed by an S that imperfects it, making for another UP. To the right of the dot, there's a standard simulus ante simulum construction, so we need to alter the second S. The 2 S's now constitute another UP. And once again, the S's are bookended by another 2 perfect B's, making for a further 2 UPs. In example 4, there are 2 dots of separation. To the left of the first one, there are 3 floating B's making a unit of perfection without any funny business. Between the 2 dots, we have another standard case of simulus ante simulum, so we have to alter the second of the 2 B's in the middle. And so as in the last 3 examples, there's 3 UPs here. 1 for the B's and 1 for each of the 2 perfect L's. Finally, to the right of the last dot, we have a B imperfecting an L, making another UP, perfect L, making yet another UP, and finally 3 floating B's, bringing the number of UPs in this example up to 7. And now a couple examples for you to try on your own. I will present the excerpt, and then you pause the video, figure it out, and then I'll present the solution and you can check your work. Alrighty, moving on. There were also rests, and there were figures for those rests. Here are the figures for those rests. Note the rule that rests cannot be imperfected regardless of simulus ante simulum, though there is a figure that represents the duration of 2 B's. Despite this, they can still function as perfect longs for the sake of causing simulus ante simulum to trigger. Let's have a look at these figures. A vertical line going through 3 spaces regardless of where on the staff it sits is equal to 3 B's. A vertical line going through any 2 spaces on the staff is equal to 2 B's. A vertical line going through a single space is equal to 1 B. And lastly, a vertical line hanging from a line reaching halfway down to the line below it across a space is equal to an S. But even now, we still have not accounted for all the necessary figures. As the 13th century transitioned into the 14th century and Franco's system of mensuration was increasingly widely circulated, a period began that we now refer to as the Ars Nova, officially beginning with the publication of a text you don't need to worry about called the Roman de Fauvel in 1310. We will be talking more about this transition in a couple videos' time. But for now, all you need to know is that with the Ars Nova came further elaborations to the Franconian system. Firstly, more species of note durations were added. The maxima was added as the new longest note value, and the minim was added as the new shortest note value. Of course, people kept on adding more. There's the semi-minim, the fusa, the semi-fusa, the drachma, the semi-drachma, the chroma, and so on. But these were very rare and appeared more often in theoretical treatises than in extant manuscripts. All that you have to worry about is the maxima and the minim. Here are their figures. The maxima is a rectangle instead of a square note head, again with the pilum, or the stem, to the right, and the minima is a semibrave with a pilum in the middle. Following this, mensuration was given a different name depending on which species it was being applied to. The mensuration at the level of the maxima was called the maximodus. At the level of the longa, it was called the modus. At the level of the brave, it was called the tempus, and at the level of the semibrave, it was called the prolatio. This will become important down the line. Another major innovation of the Ars Nova was the allowing of duple division of notes, as is now standard today. Whether the mensuration of a piece called for notes to be divided in duple or triple is also something we will learn to discern a couple videos from now. But for now, it will suffice to say that in duple mensurations, notes can't be imperfected because they are already imperfect by default, i.e., comprised of only 2 of the next smaller species. Thereby, in duple mensuration, alteration and simulus ante simulum are irrelevant. They are irrelevant, they don't matter. The final big elaboration that came from Ars Nova was the introduction of the dot of augmentation or the dot of addition, which has survived unchanged until the modern day, adding half of the value of the note it follows to that note's duration. That's right, the dot in modern notation was born 700 years ago. Unfortunately, there is no visual distinction between the dot of augmentation and the dot of separation, so which type of dot any given dot is must be determined by context alone. Remember, I did warn you, some of this gets pretty brain dead. Now, the fruit at the end of the vine. Let's look through some actual repertoire. I'm going to show you a couple of motets from the Montpellier Codex, an important source of 13th century French polyphony, likely originating in Paris. The Codex contains 336 mostly anonymous polyphonic works, probably composed around 1250 to 1300, and was likely compiled around 1300, maybe 1310. It uses a mixture of modal notation and other less popular pre-Franconian notations, as well as a decent number of works written in the Franconian manner. It has been instrumental in helping historians piece together the transition away from the modal system. Let's take a peek at some small excerpts. Here we have the quadruplum line from an anonymous motet over the Nostrum Cantus Firmus. Because it is syllabic, we don't have to deal with melismas, which is why I picked it out, because no ligatures. Also, I thought that the bunny rabbit illuminated onto the bottom of the cue was really heartwarming. With this sort of thing, it makes me smile to think of the waggish monk who must have set it down. I'm personally not convinced that these types of drawings are anything more than doodles meant to pass the time. After all, it's not as if the monk had anywhere to go or anywhere to be, and one way of passing the time isn't any better than another. Tangent aside, let's look at the music. All the way to the left of the top line, we have a clef. It's a C clef, meaning we start on a D. Because of the P-loom, we know our first thing is a perfect long, and before the rest, we see another perfect long, and this is a classic simulus ante simulum construction, so in between those two longs, we have a brave and an altered brave. Then we've got a vertical line that goes through three spaces, making that a long rest, a perfect long rest because of simulus ante simulum. And then at the end of that line, we have another perfect long floating up there, followed by brave, altered brave, perfect long for the same reasons. And then instead of a perfect long rest, we have a point of division, which serves the same function. Following that, we have brave, altered brave, perfect long, again, because of simulus ante simulum. That repeats, and it repeats, and it repeats. And then at selle, in the fourth line, we do have a quick change here because we have brave, long, brave, brave, long, and this change, this insertion of an extra brave at the beginning makes this first long imperfect, and then we have our usual brave, altered brave, perfect long construction following that, and from there on out, it's business as usual. Here's what it sounds like. And here we have our last example of the day, a motetist line from another anonymous motet from the same codex. Let's look through it. In the second example, we have 3 units of perfection on the top line, each of which is a brave imperfecting a subsequent long. After that, we have 3 braves, and together those with the L after it are a sandwich exception, so all those braves are standard. Note that just because a brave is part of a ligature doesn't mean it isn't still interacting with other notes around it. Following that, however, we do have a brave, altered brave, perfect long, because there we have, on account of the rest, a classic simulus ante simulum. After that, we've got more of the same. We've got units of perfection, except now the brave that's imperfecting the long comes after it. Two sets of that, then another classic perfect long, brave, altered brave, perfect long, simulus ante simulum construction, followed by 2 perfect longs and a perfect long rest. After that, I don't think there's anything else in here that we haven't already seen, but the full analysis is there if you want to look through it. Anyhow, that's all from me today. But after this, part 4 will also be about Franconian notation, this time with a focus on ligatures, and I hope to see you there. As always, thanks for watching.